Welcome to the channel. How are we doing today? I'm an atheist and a former Christian of 19 years who interacts with Christians on an almost daily basis because of the type of content I do, and I hear a lot of the same catchphrases from Christians over and over and over again. Some of them try to prove God's existence, some of them try to explain the nature of God or the Bible, some of them try to antagonize, and some of them are admittedly just phrases that aren't meant to add anything productive to the conversation. In this video, I'm going to be ranking some of the catchphrases I hear most often in a tier list. They'll be ranked by what appears to be the intention of the person using it, how productive it is to the conversations I have with Christians, and how passive-aggressive they are. There are going to be 5 tiers, ranging on a scale of benign to stage 4. Benign catchphrases are going to be the ones that seem to have innocent or even positive intentions, while stage 4 is going to be reserved for the worst possible things a Christian can say to someone who doesn't believe in Christianity. That being said, this is just my list, so rankings are going to be a little arbitrary, and this also isn't going to be a tier list specifically for the arguments for God's existence. That's going to be a future video. I'm going to be addressing a few catchphrases that are kind of meant to be arguments for God, but I'm more so going to be focusing on how good or bad the catchphrase communicates the argument rather than the strength of the argument itself. If you think a catchphrase should have went into a different tier, or there's one that you believe I missed and should have included, leave a comment down below and let me know your thoughts. Also, before we start, if you like content that focuses on religion and its implications and want to keep up with any future uploads, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, or whatever it is that YouTubers are supposed to say. Alright, let's get into it. The first catchphrase is, atheism is a religion. I hear this one a lot by people who want to paint atheism as something that requires the same level of devotion or dedication or faith as other religions, when all atheism is a lack of belief or a strong disbelief of a god or gods. It doesn't get any more simple than that. If you don't believe in the existence of a god, then you're an atheist. It answers one question and one question only, that being whether or not you believe that a god exists. It's not a religion any more than an empty plate is a meal, or that bald is a haircut, or that abstinence is a sex position. This one's going pretty high on the list, but not for the reason you probably think. An overwhelming majority of the people I've talked to about religion who try to go for the angle of painting atheism as a religion aren't doing so out of an honest misunderstanding. Most of the hundreds of people I've encountered that use this catchphrase only do so for the sake of trying to be inflammatory. They tend to have this idea in their heads that atheists by default are these neckbeard edgelords who would be offended at the idea of being called religious, so they just want to get a rise out of them. Personally, even though I'm an atheist now, I used to be a Christian, and a proud one at that. So trust me when I say that being called religious in and of itself isn't something that I personally have an issue with. That being said, if anyone hopes to talk to an atheist about religion in a way that's actually productive, it won't add anything to moving the conversation along to just call atheism a religion, since we kind of have to agree that words actually mean things if we want to have a conversation in a language that you share with someone you're speaking to. I want to put this one in stage 3 since it's so intellectually dishonest and counterproductive to any meaningful conversation and practice, but I've also met plenty of people who seem to have a genuine misunderstanding of what atheism is and had no issue admitting that they were wrong and proceeding in a useful way. So instead I'm going to settle right in the middle and put this one in stage 2. See you on Judgment Day is something that Christians tell me kind of at random, but also after either finding out I'm an atheist or after I criticize Christian doctrine. It's a passive-aggressive way of trying to instill fear in people just for not believing in the religion. Christians, or at least the vast majority of evangelicals I've met, have this idea that after you die, you're going to be judged by God for the life you've lived, and he'll decide whether or not you get to go to heaven or to go to hell. And apparently one of the ways to earn a spot in hell is by just not believing that the God exists in the first place. Obviously, from the outside looking in, I think that's silly as fuck, but if you do believe that's going to happen and you feel vindicated at the idea of someone being judged solely for not sharing your beliefs, you need to be put on medication. As bad as this is to say to someone, the more fair side of me wants to avoid putting this in stage 4, since there's another catchphrase or two on this list that's more direct at communicating how psychopathic evangelicals can be. That being said though, I've been told this a total of 0 times by people who aren't obviously trying to use their religious beliefs to fearmonger or just be antagonistic. People also tell me that we'll all find out what's real after we die, and that leaves the psychopathic vindication out of it, so I can respect that more than this one for sure. The 1 or 2 catchphrases on this list that also express that idea are also more direct with what they think is going to happen. Whereas the people who use this one are too cowardly to express it directly and instead leave it to you to try to digest the idea of being judged by God and what potentially happens afterward. So for those reasons, I'm just going to go ahead and put this one in stage 4. It's cooked, feed it its favorite meal, take it out behind the shit if you have to. It takes more faith to be an atheist, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. It's something I kind of hear at random when I'm discussing religion. It's this idea that not believing in a God requires an amount of faith, at least in the way that the word is used in religious contexts. It kind of has the same dishonest, counterproductive vibe as the atheism is a religion catchphrase, but a bit worse. When talking about faith in a conversation about religion, what's typically referred to is a sense of trust without regards to what the evidence has to say. Christianity in particular emphasizes having this kind of faith throughout a few verses in the Bible, a couple of which get repeated so often by Christians that I'm going to address them later on in this video. I don't have faith that there isn't a God, not because I want to squirm away from the idea, but because it's not a categorically correct word to use. If God is defined as something that created our reality and that doesn't operate by its laws and isn't tangible like everything else, then it's not something you can prove one way or the other. If that's the case, then I'm forced to look at what evidence is used to support it outside of its definition, since you can't just define things into existence. For me, I don't see any evidence for this particular God or any other one for that matter, so I have no satisfactory reason to believe in it. Faith isn't required to accept reality at face value. Like the people who call atheism a religion, this one is most commonly used for getting a rise out of atheists, at least in my experience. It's an otherwise useless opinion since even if I were to agree with it, it wouldn't lead the conversation anywhere productive. While I've met people who I have a good reason to believe were genuinely mistaken about atheism being a religion, I've met around 0 people that have said this catchphrase with honest and productive intentions in mind. For that reason, I'm going to put this a step higher than the other one into stage 3. I get told often that the reason I don't believe in God anymore is because I'm being deceived by Satan or the enemy or some force that actively wants me to not believe in God. I want to say a lot about this one, but I'm so far removed from Christianity at this point in my life that I can't take it seriously enough to give it a fleshed out rebuttal. From the outside in, it's a clear brainwashing tactic to tell someone that they don't believe in the same God as you because they're being actively tricked by an invisible force or an entity. The reason I don't believe in God anymore is because I looked at the evidence, the narrative, and the history, and thought critically about it and whether or not it lines up with how reality works. If that's the work of the devil, then it seems weird that God would allow us the ability to critically think and then allow the devil's influence to mentally look the exact same as that process. It seems even more weird that an all-powerful God would allow the devil such power in the first place, at least if the intention was for all to be saved. Seems even weirder still that an all-knowing God would create the devil with the ability to do such a thing, knowing what would happen if he did, but that's an entirely different story. This one's going high, man. It's extremely dangerous to demonize critical thinking in such a way. Not judgmental or threatening or antagonistic enough to quite go in stage 4, but it's way too dangerous to go any lower than stage 3. Christians sometimes tell me that I know that God is real just to be contrarian. I try my best to understand why people say the things that they do, but to be completely honest with you, I don't have a clue why Christians tell me this even after they find out I'm an atheist. No, I don't know that God is real, nor do I believe that one is. If you're a Christian and you think that I actually do, then let me know in the comments why you think that's the case. If you think I'm only role-playing as an atheist for content, then you should know 2 things. One is that I'm a very small content creator, and yet despite that, doing this type of content has gotten me people threatening me with eternal suffering, as well as a small number of other people taking it one step further and threatening my life. I've dealt with an unending stream of intentionally dishonest and obtuse people as well doing this. Another thing you should know is that I've read the Bible twice and that I've read the Quran once. If it were solely about gaining followers or making money, then I can promise you with my biblical and Quranic knowledge, I could instead roleplay as a Christian or a Muslim and likely grow a lot quicker and make a lot more money doing this. If I did that, I can guarantee that I'd get far less people threatening me for doing Christian or Islamic content, if anyone at all. I used to be a devoted Christian, so I understand not being able to comprehend that people can genuinely not believe in a God you're strongly convinced of. But that being said, if you're actually out to have a productive conversation with someone with a different belief, assuming that they're lying about their worldview won't get you very far. I would put this higher, but coming from a religious background, I empathize with the mindset of people who say this to atheists. So instead of putting it in stage 3, I'm going to settle on throwing this at the top of stage 2. I commonly get told that by being an atheist, I believe that everything came from nothing. that there was nothing and then there was something. That's not what I personally believe, and out of the many atheists I've talked to, I'm not bullshitting you here when I say that I've heard none of them say such a thing either. The two answers I hear most commonly from atheists is that something has always existed, or simply that they don't know why there's something rather than nothing. Personally, depending on the day, you'd hear either answer from me. The fact is that physicists, whose entire job it is to study these things, don't know what existed before the Big Bang, so obviously neither do I. By definition though, I think it's impossible for there to be truly nothing. I just think that the universe itself has always existed. Just because I don't believe in a God that had the mind to intentionally create the universe doesn't mean that the only alternative is that there was true nothingness and then something. Especially a God that's described in a book with talking animals and other things that don't follow our other facts of reality. If someone were to take the time to ask someone where they believe everything came from, that would be a far more productive and maybe even fun conversation than to assume what they believe. It would also probably serve someone better to not get their science from pastors and Christian content creators, and instead get it from people whose entire career it is to study these things. As annoying as this is to hear Christians repeat to me, the majority of Christians that I've talked to who actually wanted to have a dialogue about this make it apparent that they just don't understand the idea of everything existing without their God making it. I can also excuse scientific ignorance so long as it's not being used to harm anyone, and as long as one is willing to do the research themselves and learn something new. I'm going to put this one in stage 1, but if you think this or say this to people, try engaging first and parroting pastors second. I hear a lot of different catchphrases that show a lack of understanding about evolution, like saying that we didn't come from monkeys or asking why there are still apes if we came from apes. A lot of people make it very apparent that they think evolution works like Pokemon or some shit. I won't give a super in-depth rundown about the findings of evolutionary biology since there's a buttload of free resources out there for people who are genuinely curious. In short though, we didn't come from monkeys, nor does evolutionary biology claim such a thing. We share a common ancestor with monkeys, and if we go back far enough, we share a common ancestor with every other species on Earth too. I don't feel like giving a rundown on evolutionary taxonomy since I have like 40 more of these, but I don't mind people having an honest misunderstanding of science. I'd even put this one and the one before in the benign category, but some Christians have made it apparent that they're not ignorant, they just deny science. That can be dangerous in some more extreme situations, therefore this one's going to be joining the previous catchphrase in stage 1. Christians try to justify the morality of hell existing in a lot of different ways. One that I hear often is that hell is just separation from God, and that you shouldn't think of hell as some realm of never-ending suffering, but instead it's just the only other option when God decides that you shouldn't be in heaven with them for all eternity. Funny enough though, it always circles right back to hell being a realm of never-ending suffering. They tell me that with God is eternal paradise and peace and happiness, so logically that being away from God is just an eternity with the opposite of those things. This idea, along with the other excuses that Christians make for the hell doctrine throughout this video, never addresses the main point, that being that eternal suffering is logically not the fair punishment for finite sins. When the Christians I talk to who sin for hell hear that though, the most common example I get is prison, where punishment should be expected for crime, or in this case, sin. The issue with that is, even if you get a life sentence, it's expected to end eventually, that being when you die. Prison and jail are also meant to rehabilitate or at least teach a lesson or keep the worst of our society away from the rest of us, albeit in a way that doesn't always work in practice. Whereas eternal suffering isn't meant to teach us anything. It's not discipline, it's not rehabilitation, it's just a brute reality of suffering. The only reasons I could see someone trying to justify hell is because of cognitive dissonance or because they're too scared of God to question his ways. I can think of a few other reasons, but they always come back to giving an answer while also absolving God of any responsibility for the system, no matter how logical it is to do so. Due to the nature of hell that most Christians believe in and the gravity of the situation, I'll never rank a catchphrase low if it tries to justify the existence of hell. Since I was able to come up with a logical reason as to why someone would do such a thing, I'm not going to go so far as to put it in stage 4, but it's easily going in stage 3. Christians love telling people to repent. I hear it completely at random, sometimes when I'm just doing my religious discussion, and I've even heard it one time in real life being shouted at me and everyone else walking by some street preacher when I was just trying to catch the bus to the library. To repent means to turn from sin and dedicate oneself to the amendment of one's life. To Christians, this typically means to just drop everything and just give your life to Christ. The reason I'm going to put this one high is because the vast majority of Christians in my experience tell non-Christians to repent solely for the purpose of being passive-aggressive and judgmental. That by not being a Christian, you automatically sinned. I understand that that's what Christianity teaches, but there are far more productive ways to spread the gospel than shouting one-word catchphrases at people. I also so happen to not think people are sinners or evil solely for not being a Christian, but what do I know? It completely ignores and shuts off any potential dialogue to be had about why someone might not be a Christian. It doesn't give the opportunity to meet someone eye to eye. It's just a single word that makes evangelicals feel like they're accomplishing something by disparaging someone who's not like them. In a non-religious context, it's not a bad thing to hold oneself accountable and work to be a better person. Unfortunately, this is a video front-loaded with religious context, so that's not going to work for me. Let this catchphrase have one last beer and then unplug its life support, because this one's going in stage 4. I often get told to prove that God isn't real when people find out that I don't believe in one. There's a couple of issues with this, one being the burden of proof. For humans, not believing in God is the default. No one's born believing in a God, especially not a God as described by one particular religion. Religion is taught sometime after, most time by your parents, sometimes by your society, and more rarely is it discovered by someone on their own. Because of that, the burden of proof is on the one making the claim that a God is real, especially one described by one particular book or story like the Bible. Adding to the default facts about reality, the burden of proof is on you. For example, there is zero evidence that dragons exist. Now, if I were to tell you that there is a dragon in my closet, it would not be your burden of proof to disprove what I say. It would be my burden of proof to prove it, since I'm the one adding to the default. Another issue is how Christians define God and how it gives away the intellectual dishonesty of someone asking me to disprove their idea of God. They'll define God as something outside of space and time and that doesn't have to operate within our laws of logic, and then ask me to disprove such a thing using said logic. It's absurd. We also otherwise call things non-existent when they don't exist in space or time or logical substantiation, but that's a whole other can of worms. If a God is real and exists outside of anything that we can use to verify it, then it can't be proven or disproven. It would just come down to the individual and whether or not they're convinced by any evidence. Obviously, as an atheist, I'm just not convinced. Here's some random things that we do know about our reality, though. We know that day and night cycles require a star, and it's impossible for them to exist before a star exists. Plants also require sunlight, so it's impossible for them to exist without a star nearby. 8 billion humans with over 1,000 ethnicities cannot be descended from only 2 people since they don't have enough genetic information. We also know that snakes can't talk and that planets can't be flooded with more water than the planet has on it. Another thing we know is that women who aren't fertilized don't have children and that people don't rise from the dead on their own. Completely random facts, by the way. Part of me says stage 3 for the disingenuity that half of Christians I've talked to show me when they say this, and part of me says stage 1 because of a genuine misunderstanding that the other half had for what atheism is. I'll just split the difference and put this one in stage 2. When people either don't understand science or want to ignore some parts of it in favor of their holy book, they say things like the Big Bang or evolution is just a theory. I'll be short with this one. So when talking about science, a theory isn't just a guess or a hypothesis like we use in everyday conversation. The definition of a scientific theory is an explanation of an aspect of the natural world that can be or that has been repeatedly tested and has corroborating evidence in accordance with a scientific method using accepted protocols of observation, measurement, and evaluation of results. Where a hypothesis is just a proposed explanation for a phenomenon. In colloquial usage, the words hypothesis and theory are often used interchangeably, but this is incorrect in the context of science. With that in mind, the Big Bang isn't just a random guess about how the universe started. It's a model that explains the expansion of the universe from a hot and dense state that has evidence supporting it like redshift and cosmic microwave background radiation. The more useful question isn't whether or not it happened, but how or why it happened, which scientists are still trying to figure out. There are also other scientific theories like gravitational theory and germ theory that I haven't seen too many Christians fight back against, since those don't really fly in the face of biblical fundamentalism like the Big Bang theory or the theory of evolution does. That being said, most of the Christians that say this simply don't know the difference between scientific theory and the everyday use of it. Admittedly, it only appears to be a very stupid and very loud minority of them that stick to their guns of scientific denial after learning the difference. Honest scientific misunderstanding doesn't rank that high, and even in my schools growing up, there was more of a focus on teaching the facts instead of mulling over too much about what a scientific theory is in the first place. As annoying as this is to hear, I'll give the benefit of the doubt here and make this one the first entrant into the benign category. One of the reasons I get told that I left Christianity is because I was church hurt. Like going to church or the actions of someone in the church or watching VeggieTales made me stop believing in God. I'm going to get vulnerable for a second. I didn't have the greatest childhood in the world. I grew up very poor and my household wasn't always a loving one. I've seen some things, and I've been through some things that most people never have to see or experience. However, none of my traumas were given to me by anyone in my church's or religious environment. In fact, quite the contrary. I'm lucky enough to say that I was devoted and didn't mind the church environment, and no one in my church added to my traumas. I have friends that I hung out with outside of church all the way into my last church home before I started deconstructing. Like a lot of Christians, the comfort of religion and church was one of my escapes from the other 160 something hours of the week. I personally left church and religion because I stopped believing that any of it was true after doing a year and a half of more extensive research than most Christians do to support their beliefs in their entire lives. That being said, there are millions of children and adults out there that didn't get as lucky as I did. There are plenty of people who faced a wide variety of traumas from their church leaders and congregation. Telling someone that their church hurt intentionally minimizes the very real religious trauma that a lot of people go through and sets out to invalidate one's emotions as a valid reason for leaving. Someone leaving religion solely because they wanted God to ensure that they weren't put through a traumatic experience is 100% valid, since we're all the leaders of our own lives and aren't required to stay in a religion that we don't want to be in if we feel negatively about it. This is a wildly unempathetic, sociopathic, mean-spirited thing to say to anyone or accuse anyone of. If you feel the need to minimize someone's potential religious trauma as a jab, then I hope you live long enough for your kids to grow up and stop loving you. Let's take this catchphrase, sit in its wheelchair, roll it around to see the sun one last time, and wait for it to stop breathing, because this one's going straight into stage 4. Sometimes Christians tell me that there's no excuse to not believe in God because even Satan or the demons believe in God. Let's think about this critically for just 2.6 seconds, please. If I don't believe in God, that would have to mean that I don't believe in Satan or demons either. If I believe that the narrative is fiction, then that would extend to every fictional character in the narrative. I believe that Satan is also a fictional character, just like God. Just because he's God's enemy within the lore doesn't mean that God is real based on his enemy knowing he exists within the lore. I'll give a quick example here. Let's say I believe that Spider-Man was real, and that you have no excuse to not also believe that Spider-Man is real, because even the Green Goblin knows that Spider-Man is real. I would hope you would think that's silly, right? I wanted to put this one in the benign category since it's just a dumb thing to think, but due to the sheer goofiness of this line of thinking, I'm just going to put this one in stage 1. Please do better. When Christians hear that I and other former Christians don't believe in God anymore, they sometimes tell me that this is proof of the great falling away described in the Bible. There's a verse or two in the King James translation of the Bible in 2 Thessalonians that says the day of Christ will come after a great falling away and that more and more people will leave the faith. From the outside in, it seems more likely that Paul or whoever forged the book wanted a way to give future believers a reason to not question the religion. Like, why bother critically thinking about why you believe the things that you do if doing so is just proof that the book is true? If I had to take a stab at the reason that people, at least in the West, are leaving the religion, it's because of access to new information, easier connection to people with new ideas, and overall education becoming more accessible and flying in the face of religious claims. That being said, Christianity throughout the rest of the world is on the rise, so I'm not seeing how the decline of Christianity in the US and other Western countries shows a great falling away. More important than that, though, it's dangerous to feel discouraged from critically thinking about your beliefs, and the Bible and evangelical doctrine promotes this in multiple verses. There are still a couple of them that I'm going to get to, but this one makes people feel vindicated in their shutting off of new ideas and the rising number of non-Christians, no matter how those people got to a point of deconstructing in the first place. Like the other ideas that make people feel comfortable about not learning new things, this one's going to go in stage 3. One really judgmental accusation that I hear all the time is that I left Christianity because I wanted to live in sin. That I stopped believing in God because I didn't want to be judged by God for the wrongs I've done. I think this catchphrase is stupid for multiple reasons. The first one being that people can't just choose their beliefs. What everyone does is take in information, processes it, and is either convinced by it or not. So the idea that I chose to stop believing in God is a joke anyway, but let's assume for a second that it isn't though, and that anyone can choose what they believe in. Why would I choose to not believe in God if I believe that I was a sinner and that it has consequences? As an atheist, there's no one in the sky to forgive me for anything that I do. So I have to just accept the things I do and seek forgiveness from the people I hurt, if anyone. As a Christian, I can ask God for forgiveness for my sins. If I wanted to sin so much, the most logical thing to do is to stay as a Christian, not stop believing in God. In addition to this catchphrase being judgmental, it's also short-sighted and idiotic. This one's heading into stage 3. The catchphrase I hear that sets out to give evidence for God's existence is that everything is perfectly designed, or at least clearly shows signs of being intentionally designed. Here's a few facts about our planet. The star that we revolve around emits UV radiation that's responsible for over 80% of skin cancer. Around 20% of everyone on the planet will get cancer sometime in their life, and around 8% of people will get appendicitis. Over 70% of the planet's surface is covered in water that we can't live in as humans. Over 95% of that water is so salty that we can't safely drink it. A third of the planet's land is desert that we as humans can't use to grow food to sustain ourselves. Our atmosphere exists in a way that warm air can meet with cold air in a way that can cause tornadoes, and that warm ocean water can condense and fuel hurricanes, both of which can and have killed millions of people. The crust of the planet is formed by tectonic plates that can shift in a way that can cause earthquakes, landslides, and tsunamis, all of which have also killed millions of people. Maybe it's just flying over my head, but I'm not seeing the perfect design here. As an atheist, it makes perfect logical sense to me that a planet that works just well enough for abiogenesis and evolution to occur is going to allow life to exist on it just well enough. Without a mind that loves us creating everything in a way that we consider perfect, it makes sense that our planet works in a way that bad things can happen. It makes little to no sense to me, though, that a perfect designer would create something imperfect for his creation to live on. One could argue that this is as good as God can create it, but then you're locked out of being able to use a human idea of perfection as your standard for determining and further giving evidence for the existence of such a God. Your argument at that point is reduced to saying God exists because things are the way that they are. That being said, I've seen mountains and forests and beaches and cute animals and babies and stuff. And while I don't think they were made by a god, I can see how someone can get so caught up in the good that they stop and forget all the tragically imperfect facts about a reality, especially if they were sheltered. This catchphrase and its variants have been memed into oblivion, and rightfully so, but I'm still going to put this one in the benign tier. The idea that God doesn't send you to hell and that you send yourself is yet another one of these weird ways that evangelicals try to absolve God of any responsibility for people going to hell. They have no problem admitting that God created everything, including hell, despite whatever purpose they think it originally served. They have no problem admitting that God created Satan, or us as humans, or the planet, or the universe. They have no problem admitting that God set the rules in place that could end with someone ending up in hell, including his choice to enact a generational punishment for 2 people eating a fucking fruit. They have no problem admitting that God is all-knowing, which would have to logically mean that he knew what would happen if he created everything the way he did and set the rules that he chose. They also have no issue admitting that God is all-powerful, which would logically mean that he could have created the universe in any way he saw fit. The things that they seem to have an issue admitting, though, is anything that makes God look like the bad guy. God is apparently the only being that gets to have all of the power and none of the responsibility. If hell exists and you sin yourself, then I simply say that I choose not to go, since I'm the one with the power to avoid it, right? Apparently it's not that simple though. You need to also play by God's rules in order to not go. I don't know, this catchphrase is a whole barrel of bullshit. Like with similar catchphrases that try to morally justify the idea of people ending up in hell, I understand the reason that people don't want to put any responsibility on God. That being that they're afraid to. It's an abusive relationship, one where there's a punishment waiting for questioning the morals of the one you're in the relationship with. I get that it helps one sleep at night if they do mental gymnastics that would make Simone Biles look like Stephen Hawking. If you're a Christian watching this and want to comment something about how this idea actually makes sense, but you also believe that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and that he created everything, do us both a favor and don't. I know it's gratifying to feel like you're defending your beliefs while also keeping God blameless. However, I'm well past the point of going back and forth with people, insisting on wanting the idea of people ending up in hell for all of eternity to somehow be a just idea. Just don't comment, watch another video, watch the rest of this one if you want to, leave a dislike if it helps you feel better, but don't comment trying to explain it. No one has to know. It can be your little secret. Like the other catchphrases that try to justify something as awful as hell, this one's going straight into stage 3. Some Christians see that I make the type of content that I do and that I used to be a Christian and say that I must still believe based on the fact that I spend time talking about religion. As much as I want to be antagonistic to people that say this, since I know my intentions looking from the inside out, I'm going to try to be as fair as possible. In fact, I at least see where they're coming from, even if it's condescending to say such a thing. I'll directly talk about why I do this type of content talking about religion. I want people to have an opportunity to engage fairly and honestly with someone who doesn't think the same way that they do. People have a tendency to go their entire lives only wanting to be surrounded by like-minded people. I don't want to just troll or antagonize or be contrarian to people with different beliefs than mine. But breaking that monotony and allowing for an honest exchange of perspectives is fun for me, and I've met a solid minority of Christians and people of other religions who've also found it fun to engage with me. I also want people to critically think about why they believe the things that they do. My current bio on all of my platforms is that the truth doesn't mind being questioned. And if someone believes in something false, I want to offer an opportunity to correct that, or at least to have a valid answer to the question of why you hold your beliefs. I also want to learn new things myself. Doing this type of content has given me hundreds of opportunities to expand my knowledge in fields like physics, biology, theology, history, and philosophy. I also do this to have some fun, and I don't see what's wrong with that. I like making people laugh, and I like laughing, and I enjoy having a community of people whose day I improve with my content and who improve my day in return. That all being said, this isn't all I do. Obviously I work, since enough money to make a 7-Eleven snack run a month isn't enough to live off of. I game, I watch things like esports and professional wrestling, and I have a life outside of content. I don't do this because I secretly still believe in God, and I fail to see how a belief in God can be the only explanation to why someone would want to spend time talking about religion. I'd put this one in the benign category, but the clear intention of condescension bumps this one up to stage 1. Objective morality is a doozy to talk about, since most of the Christians who bring this term up to me make it very clear that they're just recycling it from some other apologists like Cliff Nechtel. Basically, some Christians hold this idea that without a God, you can't have a moral system and that you're logically confined to thinking that everything is morally permissible. To me as an atheist, this looks like a very clear attempt to hijack people's sense of moral conviction and to use their religion's God to take credit for it. Mainly because I'm not seeing how a lack of a God to dictate moral convictions has to mean that everything is good by default. Especially since they can instead logically say that without a God, one has to think that everything is bad too. I mean, that doesn't make sense either, but it follows the exact same line of logical progression. The more slimy, dishonest debate bros who use this line of thinking care less about trying to honestly account for atheists having moral systems, and more about trying to paint atheists out as monsters who find things like rape and pedophilia to be morally permissible. Another glaring issue with this catchphrase is the use of the word objective to describe moral systems given by a God. For something to be definitionally objective, it has to be uninfluenced by personal feelings or opinions in its consideration and representation of facts. If moral systems are given by God, then that morality becomes definitionally subjective, since it would be based on God's personal feelings. The only way I can think of that it wouldn't be is if moral truths existed external to God, but that just shoots the entire argument in the foot. God-given morality also doesn't account for why different cultures and religions and society have different moral frameworks, assuming that God created all of humanity with moral systems. The biggest glaring issue with the moral argument from Christians in particular is that the God of the Bible committed genocide, condoned slavery and rape, and commanded infanticide. And it doesn't make sense that such a God is the reason why I find things like genocide, slavery, rape, and infanticide to be disgusting. Why would a God make me to morally disagree with his actions and preferences? I'll touch more in depth on the things that seem to be the actual explanations for morality in a future video where I rank arguments for the existence of God. But in short, if you need a book or an invisible entity to dictate your moral convictions, stay far the fuck away from me. This one does so many things wrong, I'm gonna put it in stage 2. Another common one I get is that I can't see air or oxygen or the wind, but I know it exists. In the same way, I should know that God exists without seeing him. Here's a fun fact about our reality. Almost all elements and compounds can at least hypothetically be frozen into a liquid or a solid, including elements and compounds that are gases at regular temperatures like oxygen is. I invite anyone using this to go to the YouTube search bar, search up liquid oxygen, and watch a video about it. You can even make it yourself at home, it's really fun. The King of Random did a few fun videos about it a while back, I'd recommend those. Back to the point though, the reason I don't believe in God isn't solely because I can't see him. It's not even that I can't use any of my senses to know him. I don't believe in God because we can't even logically substantiate that one exists in the first place. That is, of course, unless we use some logically fallacious thinking or make some scientifically unnecessary assumptions. This one's silly. Please stop with this one. I want to chuck this one right into stage 1. The idea that God is outside of space and time makes no sense whatsoever, or at the very least logically contradicts with the idea of a God that's both omnipresent and eternal. If we're going to speak a mutually understood language with each other, then it's best that we operate using the established definitions of words within that language. The definition of eternal is something that lasts or exists forever without end or beginning, and an eternity is defined as an infinite measure of time. Omnipresent means to be in all places at all times, and omnipresence is the quality or state of being omnipresent. If something is outside of space, then it definitionally can't be omnipresent since it's outside of the very thing needed for definitional omnipresence. If something is outside of time, then it's not eternal since it's outside of the thing that's needed for definitional eternity. If both of these are true, then a God that's outside of space and time logically cannot be omnipresent or eternal, meaning the Christian God cannot be real. The people who use this catchphrase try so hard to cling to the idea in a few different ways, and I don't know why. There are so many better and effective theistic talking points, and I'm even saying this as an atheist. One of the ways is by just changing the definitions of the words omnipresent and eternal, and I can't have a conversation with people like that. If we can't even agree on definitions, then I refuse to waste time doing freestyle linguistics with someone. They also try just saying that he's outside of our understanding of time and space, and that conversation's one I'm done having as well. It's useless at that point to try to have a conversation with someone who expects you to throw away your very understanding of concepts for the evidence to make sense. Whichever apologist started this sci-fi nonsense has ruined an entire generation of apologetics. Normally I'd put scientific or definitional misunderstandings in stage 1, but this one's different. In addition to causing me an endless amount of annoyance, it's also eye-opening to watch people do conversational backflips to defend a non-starter of an idea that I absolutely have to put it in stage 2. When I hear someone say that the Bible has so many cross-references, I typically don't even know how to respond to that. By cross-references, what a lot of Christians mean, in my experience, is that parts of the Bible story or narrative are referenced in another part of the Bible, and I'm not sure why that's special. I understand that the Bible was compiled over a few to couple hundred years, but even as an atheist, I don't see why it would matter to the validity of the story. Especially when you look at potential skeptical explanations of why the book would reference itself, such as later Christians and authors wanting to write in fulfillments of biblical stories for political control. On its face though, I don't consider that fact to be miraculous any more than I consider it a miracle that someone in school managed to pass an open book test. Admittedly though, I've heard many different ideas on what even counts as a cross-reference, so if you can shed some light on that, let me know in the comments, since I try my hardest to not talk out of my ass. I'm going to put this one in the benign category, since even if I had a more confident grasp on what's considered a cross-reference, I still don't see any malicious intent behind using that fact as evidence. Not any evidence that I find convincing, obviously, but not seemingly harmful either. When explaining God's nature, or when backed into a corner after attempting to give evidence for God, I often hear his ways are not our ways, or our finite minds can't understand an infinite God, or something like that. Basically something that absolves the person I'm having a discussion with from having to even try to explain God to me. This one's dangerous in that it's one of those catchphrases that's meant to discourage one from thinking too hard about God. It's also conversationally counterproductive, since what else is there to say after this? It makes sense that a being with the ability to create our reality would be far too complex for us, I mean sure, but on the flip side, such a God would also be too complex to sufficiently explain to someone who's unconvinced of its existence. At best, this is a discussion killer, and at worst, it's an excuse to not critically think or to even feel justified in doing bad things in the name of God. Like the other critical thinking killers on this list, this one's going in stage 3. Here we are with yet another hell justifier. This time it's the idea that hell wasn't made for us. On paper that's cool, and it's an idea held by some universalists and annihilationists who believe that everyone goes to heaven and that the soul just gets destroyed if God doesn't want you in heaven, respectively. Most commonly though, Christians tell me this to yet again attempt to absolve God of any responsibility for people going to hell. This one's usually served on the side of another catchphrase or two on this list, like the idea that hell is just separation from God, and that's the only place you can go if you choose not to be with God if you send yourself to hell, despite the fact that it wasn't made for us. The undeniable fact of the matter is that if God created everything, including hell, and if God is all-knowing, which means that he knew that humans would go there, and if he's all-powerful, meaning that he wasn't forced to make the rules that would end with people in hell, then yes, hell was explicitly made for us, as well as the demons and the devil and anyone else that ends up in there. It's not something I'm going to debate either. If you're cool with the idea of people suffering for all of eternity, then I love that for you. However, I'm not going to waste my time trying to pluck away responsibility from the God character when he's supposedly the absolute creator. If you've been watching this long, you already know where this one's headed. I'm putting this one right into stage 3. I can't help but roll my eyes when someone says that they're sorry that someone misrepresented Jesus to me. I touched on this earlier in the video, but I didn't leave the religion for the way I was treated by someone in the church. I liked church back when I used to go, and my reasons for leaving were purely logical. While I've been dealing with nasty Christian behavior ever since, that's not the reason I've stayed away thus far. On paper, it's a nice gesture to apologize on behalf of someone in the group for being a dick, and I know it seems cynical that I speak badly about this catchphrase. That being said though, over 90% of the time that I get told this, it's by someone who didn't bother to first ask about my background. They just assume a villain, then apologize for that made up villain's behavior. That shows that they don't actually care about making amends, and more about either bringing me back to Christianity or just saying empty words to feel like they've done something useful. They also use this exact same wording verbatim most of the time, showing that it's just a prepackaged non-apology. If you're a Christian and want to say this to former Christians, at least ask our background before whipping this out. Apologizing at random just makes you look dismissive and artificial. It's way too fake nice to go any lower than stage 2 on this list. Every painting has a painter, or every building has a builder is a super overused catchphrase used to show that God exists by way of reality existing in the first place. Basically, it says that since it's apparent that things that are created require someone to do so, reality altogether works the same way. However, it's a fallacious line of thinking. Firstly, it's a false equivalence. It uses examples of things that we know require intervention in order to exist, like paintings and buildings, and tries to equate it to the universe as a whole, which hasn't been verified as needing outside interference to exist one way or the other. To give an example, I'll use the same line of thinking to argue for atheism. We look at rocks and know that they're natural and don't require anyone to create them. Therefore, the universe works the same way and God doesn't exist. It's a half-baked line of thinking. Another possible fallacy that this commits is the composition fallacy, since it assumes that what's true for some things in the universe must also be true for the universe itself. It'd be like arguing that cars are made entirely out of rubber just because its tires are. Some of them use it as an extension of the argument that everything is designed in the way that paintings and buildings are, but I already went over that earlier. As overused and illogical as this catchphrase is, it's ultimately harmless on its own, and I just suggest that anyone that says or thinks this to learn about how logical fallacies work. With that in mind, I'm going to put this one in the benign category. Imagine this for a second. You, everyone you know and don't know, and the entire universe were made by an all-powerful being that you can't see. Now, this all-powerful being wants you to love him and follow his commands. If you do, then after you die, you get to experience paradise and happiness. However, if you don't, then you're going to suffer for all of eternity. Now, one thing that qualifies someone for ending up suffering forever is not believing that all of this is true. Would you then think it's a good thing to do to passively aggressively tell someone to enjoy that suffering since they don't even believe in the story? Most likely not, since most of us aren't antisocial psychopaths. Yet this is something I have Christians tell me all the time. I don't have much to say about this one, but if you ever think that's something good to say to someone, fuck you. Take this catchphrase and call us family. Let them know that now is probably a good time to stop by and reminisce about the good times they had together, maybe say some last words, and then walk out of his hospital room. This one's going in stage 4. Some Christians have this idea that the Big Bang is a Christian theory, or that it proves Christianity to be true, or that I should also accept Christianity since the person who laid the groundwork for the modern understanding of the Big Bang was a Catholic. The person they're referring to when they talk about this is Georges Lemaitre, who is a Belgian physicist as well as a Catholic priest. He proposed the hypothesis of the primeval atom, which paved the way for physicists after him to understand the idea of universal expansion. There's a couple issues with this though. First being that the Big Bang theory has nothing to do with religion one way or the other. It doesn't automatically disprove any hypothesis about what happened before the Big Bang, not the secular or religious ones. It's just describing the way the universe expanded from a really hot, really dense state billions of years ago. Georges was obviously a brilliant physicist, and I don't think any less of him or want to take anything away from his contributions to physics just because of his religious beliefs or occupation outside of his research. I'm not so cartoonishly anti-Christianity that I discount someone's work due to their beliefs just because I have different religious beliefs, and you shouldn't either. He was able to separate his theology from his research like all honest scientists should do, religious or not. Some Christians that use this catchphrase say that he had religious intentions behind his research, but that's an outright lie. He even went so far as to convince the Pope at the time to stop making remarks about the relation of science and religion after the Pope drew a parallel between the Big Bang and the Christian creation story. Even if this weren't a lie, it would be irrelevant since God's existence isn't alluded to by any scientific findings so far. No one is required to accept Christianity because of the religious leanings of one physicist any more than they're required to accept Hinduism because of one forming the foundations of atomic theory. Considering that there's also a fuck ton of scientists who are atheists, I don't know if that's the route that Christians want to go down. The second big issue with this is that it ignores religious demographics around the time that Georges made his contributions. In the 1930s, when the primeval atom hypothesis was first proposed, over 90% of Belgium was Catholic, meaning that if anyone from Belgium did anything at the time, noteworthy or not, there was a 90% chance that they were Catholic. A lot of the Christians that use this are spreading a verifiable lie, so that makes me want to put it in stage 2. However, I'm going to be a little less cynical here and just say that they're repeating a lie that they haven't verified rather than that they're choosing to lie when they say this. Therefore, I'm going to put this one with the other scientific misunderstandings into stage 1. Christians often end their exchanges with God bless, especially if the conversation had to do with religion. This one is as ubiquitous with Christian passive aggression as Dollar General is with low-income neighborhoods. The ones who seem more genuine with actually giving well wishes are the ones who can bother adding a couple words to it like may God bless you or some shit. On paper it's nice, so thanks, I guess. It's a definite eye roller though. I uploaded a reel recently to Instagram where Christians felt the need to justify the morality and justice of hell, and so many of the comments ended with God bless that I thought I was getting botted with AI accounts for a bit. It doesn't really add anything to a conversation, nor was it meant to in my experience with Christians. It's just a useless lump of a catchphrase, and it's still treatable with surgery, so I'm going to go ahead and put it in stage 1. Jesus is King is one of the newer ones that Christians are adopting. It's exactly like God bless in that it's just a functionless mold of a catchphrase. While God bless is favored by the older Christians, Jesus is King is more so the bread and butter of this new age breed of Christian Zoomers that like to spam Psalms 23 in the comment section of random videos. I mean, there's a Kanye West album named this, so I guess it checks out. I won't even go into the biblical reasons that Jesus wasn't a king since I'll save that for a future video. Also, a personal anecdote, I keep seeing this one getting used by the worst people ever, but I won't let that affect the ranking. Like there's content creators and influencers and personalities who will say the most vile shit ever about people who aren't male, white, straight, or cisgender, then turn around and say Jesus is king. Just something I noticed. Anyway, I don't know what else to say about this one. It's going to join this equally useless cousin in stage 1. Find God is one of the go-tos that Christians tell me after finding out I'm an atheist. It's quick, albeit also counterproductive and dismissive. If God is omnipresent, why are so many people having an issue finding him? Christians should shove an AirTag up his ass or something. Anyway, I already tried finding God and have had trouble locating him. That's why I'm no longer a Christian, not because I didn't try to find God in the first place. Since God's all-knowing, he should know exactly where to find me. If he doesn't want to find me, then he's content wherever he's at, so who am I to disturb him? For the dismissive assumption that this catchphrase makes, I'm going to go ahead and put it in stage 2. One of the most intellectually dishonest ways that Christians defend the Bible is by saying that the verses are being taken out of context. In particular though, only the verses that are scientifically outlandish, narratively contradictory, or morally repugnant. Take for instance 1 Samuel chapter 15, which is the story of Saul's rejection as king of the Israelites for Saul not fully obeying God's command to completely destroy the Amalekites for an attack that they made on the Israelites over 400 years earlier. In verse 3, Saul is told by Samuel on behalf of God to destroy the Amalekites, and the verse explicitly says that Saul is commanded to kill man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Now someone who isn't a disingenuous sick fuck will look at that and say that God very clearly commanded the slaughter of babies, no matter how they feel about such a thing. A shocking number of Christians, however, will accuse me of taking the verse out of context as if the verse didn't clearly say exactly what it said, or as if such a thing is ever a reasonable thing to excuse. They do this with every verse that takes away from the idea of biblical perfection. Jesus dying for your sins and rising from the dead. Amen, hallelujah, coolest of beans. Paul being misogynistic in 1 Timothy chapter 2 verse 12. Out of context, obviously. God commanding us to not murder each other in the 10 Commandments. Great, we love that. That makes our tummies warm. God condoning Israelites taking foreigners as chattel slaves in Leviticus chapter 25 verses 44 through 46. That's obviously taken out of context. Some of them accuse me of taking verses out of context before even learning what verses I'm talking about when I bring up a criticism of the book. As far as disingenuity goes, this one's high up there. I'm going to put this one right into the top of stage 2. Another idea that Christians use as a cop-out to not answer for narrative criticism is the idea that one needs the Holy Spirit to understand things properly. When I put these catchphrases into the tier list maker, they were randomized, so I'm really glad that I got this one right after the one I just talked about. It's a cop-out just like the other one, except this one says that you need some sort of invisible force of God to be able to make sense of the Bible or the teachings or the implications. If this one were true, then there wouldn't be tens of thousands of denominations of Christianity. If everyone were worshiping the same God and had the right idea of who Jesus was, you would think they'd all have the Holy Spirit that led them to one truth. However, Christians can't even agree on the basics. Narrative literalism versus allegorical philosophy, the meaning of the verses, the application of doctrine, the rules to follow. So many Christians seem to not have the Holy Spirit leading them to the truth. One could argue that only a select few have the Holy Spirit even within the religion, but what method can one use to figure out who that is? Spoiler alert, there isn't one. From the outside in, this just seems like a way to further blame the biblical or religious critics for not being able to make logical or moral or narrative sense of Christianity. I'm splitting hairs here, but at least this one doesn't try to accuse critics of not even being able to comprehend the words that they're reading, so I'll go ahead and put this one right behind the previous catchphrase in stage 2. Christians often tell me that science proves God. No intro to this one, honestly, since I already covered a lot of what I had to say when talking about the idea that the Big Bang is a Christian theory. To give a short recap though, nothing about what science has been able to verify points to God or away from God. If it did, then there wouldn't be a disproportionate amount of atheist scientists. It also shoots the doctrine of God wanting to be believed in through faith in the foot. A lot of them use this as an opening to some partially scientific argument for God, like the Kalam cosmological argument or the argument for motion. Like I said a few other times in this video, I'm going to be addressing those arguments as well as a fair amount of other popular arguments for God in a future video or tier list. It's just a silly idea though, and I wish I'd stopped hearing it, to be honest with you. I'm going to chuck it into stage 1 though. Blessed are those who believe without seeing is a paraphrase of a verse in the Bible, that being John chapter 20 verse 29. In the story, Thomas doubts that Jesus rose from the dead and wants to verify it by seeing the holes in his hands from his crucifixion. So Jesus shows him, and then Thomas acknowledges him as God. Jesus then replied that Thomas has believed because of what he's seen, but blessed are those who haven't seen and yet believed. As a skeptic, it seems a lot more likely that this verse was written into the Bible by the writer of John to encourage Christians to believe in spite of what the evidence is, and that's very dangerous. I don't think it should be considered a virtue to blindly follow things that discourage you from wanting evidence for it being true, or at least encourage you to not seek it. The current quote in my bio on all platforms is, "The truth doesn't mind being questioned," and it's half a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche. The other half of the quote is that a lie doesn't like being challenged. If something's true, then I fail to see why it would matter if you hold it to scrutiny, especially if there's an expectation that you dedicate your life to the thing. If you feel as if you have a solid reason to believe, then that's always going to be better than not giving any substance to your beliefs like Jesus encourages in this verse. I'm putting this one in stage 3. When calling Christianity a religion, sometimes I'll hear that it's not a religion, it's a relationship with God. Or that Jesus didn't come to preach religion, he came to preach a relationship. I'm going to hold your shoulder when I tell you this, but Christianity is definitionally a religion. A religion is defined as a personal set or institutionalized system of religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices, or as the service and worship of God or the supernatural. There are only 2 reasons I could think of that Christians sometimes try to paint the religion out as something different than what it is. One being that they don't want their religion to be considered on the same logical or devotional or definitional level as the other thousands of religions out there. I mean, how else are you supposed to have a reason to invalidate everyone else's beliefs if you don't try to make yours more special than theirs? The other reason is out of wanting to avoid the negative connotation that sometimes comes with the word religion. This one's so bad and so goofy. It can give way for a sense of religious superiority, so I can't quite put it in the benign category. It's also not quite dishonest enough to go into stage 2, so I'm going to cut it down the middle and put it in stage 1. Sometimes when people hear that I used to be a Christian and that I left, they'll tell me that I was never really a Christian. To them, if I take this at face value, they think that in order to be a Christian, you have to have a level of devotion that can never allow you to leave the faith. Let's break this down logically and then biblically. First, logically. It makes no sense whatsoever that someone can't possibly go from a state of wholeheartedly believing in one thing to not believing in that thing anymore. Imagine if I were to tell someone that no longer believes in Santa Claus that they never truly believed in Santa or the Christmas spirit. That to truly be considered a believer in Santa Claus, you have to be so devoted that you can never consider not having faith that he's going to slide down your chimney and leave presents every Christmas Eve. It paints this asinine idea that someone can't come to learn new information that makes them realize that something they used to believe in was false. Now obviously Santa Claus is real, but I hope you get where I'm coming from. It also forces them into the logical conclusion that no one can be considered a true Christian until they die, since anyone can leave while they're alive. Let's move on to why this idea doesn't even have a biblical leg to stand on. The verse that Christians use to back up this idea is in 1 John chapter 2 verse 19. In this verse, John says, "They went out from us, but they did not belong to us. For if they had belonged to us, they would have remained with us. But by going out, they made it plain that none of them belongs to us." Christians interpret this verse as being about people who believed in Jesus, but who stopped believing. Now it's my turn to be a context Andy and read the literal verse before it, which is 1 John chapter 2 verse 18. It reads, "Children, it is the last hour. As you have heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come. From this we know that it is the last hour." That makes it clear that John was referring to believers in a false Christ and who were following false teachers, rather than later Christians who stopped believing in the entirety of the narrative like myself. If these chuckle fucks spent more time reading the book that's supposed to be the guideline of their lives rather than trying to antagonize ex-Christians, they would have known that though. Besides the obvious invalidation that this catchphrase tries to do though, I simply can't understand what Christians who tell me this during my live discussions expect me to do about it. Like, oops, Orthodox cross emoji, follower of Christ 69420, Vatican City flag emoji says I was never really a Christian. I guess I'll just end the stream and go kill my. I can't help but feel as if the people who tell me this are just trying to keep their religion as some perfect, undeniable thing in their mind that's beyond reproach, to the point that they find it easier to attempt to invalidate the beliefs of someone who stopped believing in it, rather than think of it as something that's unimportant or imperfect enough for people to stop being convinced of. Just to keep track, not only is this catchphrase counterproductive and invalidating, it's also wildly illogical. It's super unfortunate that this catchphrase denied chemotherapy. I understand that it didn't want to lose its hair, but there are beautiful looking wigs that it could have worn in the meantime. Unfortunately though, it's far too late to save it now. Call up your local funeral home and see what their packages include and if it's in your price range, because this catchphrase is going in stage 4. Christians commonly tell me to seek God with all my heart after I tell them that my search for a reason to believe in God came back flat. A lot of what I had to say about my search has already been said by now, but I don't like this one. This one, along with a lot of the other things that Christians say about how you should search for God, tries to put the blame on you for not believing in God. According to them, it's not only impossible that God doesn't exist, but also it's not his fault if someone ends up not being convinced of its existence. It's always that you left too soon, you didn't believe hard enough, you didn't seek hard enough. It's 100% of the time your fault. The unfortunate part about this one is that the people who say this are too wrapped up in their absolution of God to see why it's unhelpful or even frustrating for some ex-Christians to hear this. As if we tore down our entire way of thinking about our reality just because we dropped our phone or burnt our toast. Right along with just telling people to find God, I want to slam this one right into stage 2. I'll pray for you or praying for you is another bread and butter passive aggressive catchphrase. Seems cynical to say that, but Christians have made it abundantly clear that the intentions usually aren't genuine. Recently I uploaded a reel to Instagram where I requested that Christians not pray for me because I don't want it, and to instead use that prayer on someone who can hypothetically need it more than me, like sick or starving people. The overwhelming majority of comments I got were either that they were going to pray for me anyway, or trying to defend the idea that they can pray for both me and those other people, despite the fact that I explicitly said in the video that I don't want their prayer. I'd say that's proof that some Christians don't care about consent, but the multiple cases of church staff being arrested for harming kids every week kind of gave that away already. Additionally, in Matthew chapter 6 verse 5, Jesus himself says not to be public with your prayer. These people would know that though if they read the book that they claim to live by. I want to be consistent and put this with the other useless sentence enders, but it's far too condescending to be put any lower than stage 2. God loves you or Jesus loves you is yet another piece of junk catchphrase. This one is especially overused and useless. I see this one typed everywhere. Sometimes Christians just say it randomly, sometimes they just use it to end messages. It's the dandelion of the uncut abandoned house lawn that is my live chats and DMs. It adds absolutely nothing to anything whatsoever. It's like a wilted, unsalted leaf of iceberg lettuce. No flavor, no crunch, just a feel-good waste of keyboard taps. Like, what am I expected to do? Oh, you're an atheist after spending over a year and a half of your life doing daily extensive research to find evidence that God was real? Well, guess what? Jesus loves you. Okay, now what? Do I become a priest or some shit? Get a tattoo of Philippians 4:13 on my right ass cheek or something? Start speaking in tongues and doing a crip walk? It's just so tiresome. While this isn't as outwardly passive-aggressive as I'll pray for you, its sheer uselessness and overuse puts it right alongside it in stage 2. Funny story, I most commonly hear that God isn't a genie after I tell Christians that part of the reason that I deconstruct it was because God didn't answer my prayers for a sign or something to go by. Like, Christians have a habit of telling me to pray to God to restore my faith or to show himself, and then say that he doesn't just grant wishes when I tell him that it failed. You just can't win with these people. I fully understand if God didn't answer my prayer to put $10,000 in my PayPal or something, but I don't think that a sign that he exists so that I may continue to dedicate my life to him was all that much to ask for. Especially if he's claimed to have wanted a relationship with me, and also that he's all-knowing, meaning that he would know what would convince me. Myself aside though, I've heard some Christians use this in some supremely unempathetic and borderline sociopathic ways. Like when I ask why God doesn't just heal kids dying from cancer or protect them from getting assaulted. It's just a dismissive, weird thing to say. In practice, I want to go as high as to put this in stage 3. That being said, it's not quite as dangerous or antagonistic as the other ones in that category, just apathetic and sometimes presumptuous. So I'll settle in stage 2 for this one. Life from non-life is an overused catchphrase that Christians use as an argument for God's existence. Basically, according to them, since the modern conditions of the planet only allow for life to be produced from other living organisms, that would mean that we ultimately had to have a living source that they define as God. The first big issue is that it's a special plea. To them, we're required to need something alive to arise from, but God doesn't. Now, the response I get 99% of the time is that since God is the source, he doesn't require a life source or a creator. Then that just shoots the argument that life needs life in order to exist in the foot. The argument literally boils down to life can only come from life except for God. If even Christians don't believe the rule 100%, why should I? Let's get out of the internal critique though and address the scientific elephant in the room. Christians who use this, at least the ones who didn't just hear it from a Cliff video and ran with it without any research, don't understand what life is and also clearly haven't researched abiogenesis. In a scientific sense, life is defined as an organismic state characterized by capacity for metabolism, growth, reaction to stimuli, and reproduction. That's literally it. Biology is just an advanced form of chemistry, and as far as scientific study is concerned, life isn't some special force that's fundamentally separate from the elements that make us. It's intuitive to reflect on one's ability to be self-aware and hold it to a higher sense of importance than science could ever account for, so I won't knock anyone for doing so. I mean, we don't go around telling our loved ones that our serotonin and vasopressin and dopamine and norepinephrine loves them, so I get it. As far as how the first organisms and its parts gained the ability to metabolize, grow, react to stimuli, and reproduce, there are a lot of fun papers and experiments you can read about that can do far more justice in explaining the hypothesis a lot better than I can in a tier list video. In addition to scientific misunderstanding, this one's also loaded with a logical fallacy as well as being massively overused by especially younger Cliff Nechtel fans. It doesn't shoehorn an unproductive assumption about atheism in it though, so I think that this spot in stage 1 is a fair place to put it. A lot of the time when I ask why God doesn't show himself in a tangible way, I hear that it's not about evidence, it's about faith. As a skeptic, this seems odd to me. Why is blind faith so important to a being that's powerful enough to create entire universes? Logically, it makes zero sense that a being powerful enough to do anything, knowledgeable enough to know what would convince everyone that he's real, and that wants a relationship with us, wouldn't just show himself to the people he claims to want to be with for all of eternity. Especially if he's also all-loving and also if the alternative of someone not choosing him is hellfire. I commonly hear two responses to this, first being that he wants you to make a free-willed choice to follow him and that tangible evidence would force the relationship. I fail to see how that makes sense though. According to the Bible, the ruler of this world is Satan. Jesus himself describes him as such in John chapter 12 verse 31. If Satan can offer worldly pleasures to us in exchange for us following him, or at least not following God, while knowing that hell exists, and a world ruled by Satan is the first one we're exposed to, couldn't someone hypothetically know for 100% certain that God exists and use their free will to instead follow Satan? If so, what sense does it make to say that tangible evidence would negate our free will choice in the matter? Also, every other relationship works in the way that you have to at least be convinced that the other party exists before either choosing or rejecting them. Why would a relationship with God be any different? Better yet, why should a relationship with God be any different? The other response I hear less commonly is that if he showed himself to everyone tangibly, then everyone would be saved. Doesn't that shoot the entire point of spreading the gospel in the head? How would it be a bad thing if everyone were saved? Not even speaking for myself here, since obviously I don't believe in any of this, but from God's point of view, isn't it a good thing that everyone is saved? From the outside looking in, this looks more so like yet another catchphrase meant to make Christians comfortable with never questioning their beliefs. One could argue that God has already made himself apparent, so there is no excuse, but obviously not. I mean, only 31% of the planet is Christian. If one were to argue that simply believing in the Abrahamic God is what saves you, only about 57% of the world believes in this God. Over half, sure, but 43% of everyone alive not being saved seems like a massive oversight in how God showed himself. I think religious faith is an inefficient tool to achieve salvation, as well as a useless thing to apply to your life in general, but that's a whole other story, obviously. I also think that a true story wouldn't have had to have spread by bloodshed like the Abrahamic religions have, but that's just my ancestors talking. If you're a Christian and believe that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, and wants a relationship with us, as well as believing that hell exists and that not following God can earn one a spot there, do me a favor and don't comment trying to explain the faith doctrine to me. It'll be a waste of both your time and my time. Like the other catchphrases on this list that set out to discourage critical thinking, this one can lead to potentially dangerous ways of thinking or even worse, actions. I can't let this one go any lower than stage 3. Christians often tell me that I'm lost by either not believing in God or by not understanding Christian doctrine. I'm here to tell you proudly that I'm not lost. In fact, I'm currently in my home. I have nothing to say to this one in the same way that this catchphrase has nothing productive to say to me. This catchphrase isn't lost, instead it's found a new home right in stage 2. One idea that gets catapulted at me sometimes is this idea that one must first have faith in God before he shows himself or gives tangible evidence. As someone who used to be a Christian and had faith in God, I can confidently say that that's a crock of horseshit. Myself aside though, the logic of this must be out on vacation or something. Like, what sense does it make that one must first believe in a thing in order to get evidence of the thing? What is God, Tinkerbell or some shit? That seems to be an extremely inefficient way of going about getting people to believe in you. To me, it makes far more sense that God just doesn't exist, rather than that God has such a faith fetish that he'll allow people to not be saved because of it. This one also seems more like a way to just put the blame on people instead of God for when they don't find God after seeking him. Therefore, I'm going to put it right alongside the other catchphrase I see that does the same thing and drive it right into stage 2. One of the most common arguments I hear Christians make is that I should believe in God based on this idea that there's no downside to being wrong as a Christian, but a very bad downside to being wrong as an atheist. They say if a Christian is right about God existing and lives for him, they go to heaven, whereas they cease to exist if they're wrong about God. On the other hand, if an atheist is right, they cease to exist anyway, whereas they go to hell if they're wrong about God. This one is a super common argument that Christians make, and it's called Pascal's wager. It's named after Blaise Pascal, who first wrote about it around 1657. While this is a common argument, I'm going to flesh out what I think about it here and not save it for any future arguments for God video, since technically this isn't an argument for God's existence, but rather the potential utility in believing in God. Even then though, it fails. First issue is that it assumes that people can arbitrarily choose their beliefs, when that's just not how it works. When someone comes to learn new information, their brain takes it in, processes it, and is either subconsciously convinced by it or not. So while it's a cool thought experiment, it doesn't help to make an argument for the supposed rationality of believing in God without otherwise giving a convincing, logical reason for someone to give substance to the idea of one existing. Next, it paints this idea that it's Christianity or nothing when there are thousands and thousands of religions out there. If all religions offered up the same amount of evidence for their gods existing, then this supposed gamble that people are making with their beliefs isn't a coin flip, it's a roulette spin on a wheel with thousands of pockets. Considering that no one alive can be verified to have experienced an afterlife, Christians are making just as much of a gamble as anyone else. Christianity is the world's most popular religion, sure, but ultimately that doesn't increase the odds of its afterlife or God being true mathematically. What I'm getting at is that if we want to paint religious beliefs as a call and a gamble, Christians are making just as much of a call as anyone. Let's imagine that the God that actually exists is named Christina. Now, Christina is a jealous God, but she's so jealous that she considers it more insulting that people believe in a false God than if they didn't believe in a God at all. Now, Christina doesn't care if someone actually believes in her or not, so she's not going to leave evidence of her existence. She only cares if someone believes in a God that isn't her. Now, if you died not believing in a God at all, you get your own universe to yourself where you can shape it in any way that you want to, and you can forget that you created everything so you can enjoy things more genuinely. And if you accidentally stress yourself out with the reality you've made, then your memories of being the creator would come back to you so you can change something. And you can also cease existing at any moment you want to. Or if you die and somehow end up guessing that Christina exists, you get this stuff anyway, but she gives you a big fat kiss on the forehead before she gives you your universe. However, if you die and believe in a wrong God, you get all this stuff anyway, but every 23 days you randomly wake up tied to a chair in a dark room, or you have to watch one guy, one jar 10 times in a row before everything goes back to normal. And you never remember that it's going to happen after it's done, so you're always confused when it does. Now that you've been made aware of Christina's existence, you're now running the risk of being punished. Can you make yourself believe this story? Probably not, obviously, but by not believing, then you're taking a gamble. If you believe that you can choose your beliefs, and also that believing in the existence of a God is the best way to appease them, and that appeasing them is the way to a good afterlife, then you should be an omnist, not any one particular religion. I'll be honest, I smoked a big dog of a joint before recording that part, so please forgive me if I went off the rails. Anyway, Pascal's wager fails miserably at what it tries to do in at least 3 distinct ways. That being said, I don't think bad arguments are all that harmful in and of themselves. At least coming from a position of starting off unconvinced. Plus, as often as I hear this one, I can't bring too much ill will towards it, since the people who use it more often than not make it clear that they're coming from a place of genuine concern for what they believe will be my inevitable afterlife, rather than from a place of trying to fearmonger me into submission. Though to be fair, your mileage may vary with Christians if you speak to them about religion as often as I do. This catchphrase also at least tries to say something. At least there's an idea that it's trying to communicate rather than just an empty copy pasta nothing burger like other catchphrases. It is still a lump that you should get checked out and removed if at all possible, but in the grand scheme, I think Pascal's wager is benign. Speaking of trying to fearmonger me into submission, I get told by a lot of Christians that I'm going to pay for leading other people astray. That I'm making people question their faith with my content and that there's a punishment waiting for me for doing so. So for those who don't know, I believe all social media platforms give you the option to scroll away from live streams and videos that you aren't interested in. As far as I know, it's not written into any social media platforms' terms of service that scrolling away from videos or live streams will put you on a kill list or something. They can't control your phone and make it explode when you scroll away or anything, at least not from what I've seen. Another thing you should know is that Christians typically believe in the idea of free will, since all of Christian doctrine hinges on the idea. I'm going to address my issues with theistic free will next, but here's what I'm getting at. If Christians have free will and social media platforms allow you the physical option to scroll away or not engage with content that you don't want to see, how can my content be responsible for leading others astray? If a live stream or a video where a former Christian discusses his perspective is enough to lead someone away from their faith, and not an extensive amount of research into things that tear down preconceived religious ideas, was the faith that strong to begin with? Ultimately, my desire isn't for people to leave their religion. While I do personally think that religion has had a net negative effect on the planet, I'm fine with the idea of people believing what they're convinced of for unanswerable questions, like what happens to our mind when we die, or where did the universe come from, if anywhere. As a religion, Christianity has been used as a weapon and control tactic against indigenous people across multiple continents, and to this day as a weapon against marginalized people and non-believers. So while I do honestly consider it a good thing when someone leaves the religion, ultimately that's not my goal. I've talked to dozens upon dozens upon dozens of Christians who've made it abundantly clear that they're honest, kind, empathetic, wise, and intelligent. A lot of them being even more intelligent than myself if you ask me. What I'm after is to get people to critically think about why they believe the things they believe. If someone told me that they're a Christian because they just can't get themselves out of bed in the morning without believing that there's something higher that loves them and wants the best for them, or that they found God the most likely explanation for some aspect of our reality, or they were convinced by the historicity of the Bible, or that they prayed to God for their missing cat to come home and it did, then that's great, and I never want to take that away from them. Just ask the many Christians who come into my streams on the defensive because of their experience with other atheists, who walked away from our discussion with a new addition to their worldview after a respectful, stimulating discussion. What too many Christians do though is never ever think about it. They export that process to some guy on YouTube, swallow whatever they say whole, then regurgitate it whole whenever they run into someone who thinks differently. All while feeling justified in their disparaging of women or gay people or people who aren't convinced of the same things. If there's a punishment waiting for me for that, then that's a God I want nothing to do with anyway, even if he was real. In addition to the fear-mongering that other catchphrases toward the top of the list go for, this also double dips into trying to use a threat to make detractors tap out of wanting to talk about their perspectives openly. I'd like to wish a sincere go fuck yourself to anyone that thinks this is an acceptable thing to say to someone. Pick out a nice suit for this catchphrase, preferably in this favorite color. It doesn't have to be too expensive since it's just going to go on the ground anyway. Rent a nice hearse, call your local police department, and schedule them to escort your procession because this one's going in stage 4. Free will is an interesting one to end on. Almost all of Christian doctrine hinges on it in some way or another. Christians also use it as a cop-out to absolve God of any possible responsibility for anything negative. If someone isn't convinced that Christianity is true, then they're using their free will to deny God, and they haven't just failed to find convincing evidence for God's existence. Honestly, I have so many things to say about the misapplication of the idea of free will that I'm just going to keep this one about why it doesn't make sense in the Christian worldview. If God is our creator, meaning he's the ultimate cause of our existence, and God is also all-knowing, or at least knowledgeable enough to know what would happen if he created everything the way that he did, and God is also all-powerful, or at least powerful enough to have created everything in any way that he wanted to, or not at all, how does it make sense that we have free will? If every one of our decisions is not only pre-known to God, but intentionally set into place by God, then we can't possibly have free will. If God's knowledge and plan constrains our actions, then our will is not unconstrained. Before any Christians try to double or triple or quadruple down on the idea, ask yourself this. Did God create everything? Did God know the entire story before he wrote it? Could God have made things differently? If your answer is yes to all 3 of those questions, then I promise you that whatever half-baked can kicking won't be worth the time it takes to type it out. I don't have an issue with the idea of free will itself, but Christians seem intent on using the concept in some very intellectually dishonest ways, and I can't fap to that. So I'm going to round out this tier list by putting this in stage 2. Well, that does it for this tier list. If you take nothing else away from this video, take this from it. Be honest and be kind, whenever possible and whenever reasonable. Think for yourself as much as you can, because nobody else can do it for you. Lastly, no matter what you believe, remember the person. I know this was a long one, longer than a lot of movies, so if you watched it all the way through, even if it wasn't all in one sitting, I sincerely appreciate it, and I would like to thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like, it really helps out the channel. If you'd like to keep up with my content, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Also, you can check out either the description of this video or beacons.ai/unchainedskeptic for all of my links. I'm also on Twitch, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Kick, and Trovo, so make sure to follow me on any of those if you'd like to. If you'd like to reach me when I'm not live, the easiest ways to do so are by joining my Discord server or adding me on Snapchat. If you'd like to send text-to-speech during my streams, you can find my Streamlabs page where you can tip $1 or more for TTS, as well as my Streamlabs charity page where you can instead donate that $1 or more to the Crisis text line for TTS. Check out my treat stream if you'd like to send me some food while I'm live, or check out my throne if you'd like to send me something from my wish list. Lastly, if you want to support what I do, consider joining my Patreon or donating through Cash App, Venmo, or PayPal, or by sending Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, Bitcoin Cash, or PayPal USD to one of my crypto addresses. That's all for this video. Thank you again for watching. I hope to see you next time and take care. Bye.